Thank you so much for coming. We have a special treat in that the provost of our university, Tom Rosenbaum, has come to talk a little about since this is a conference about the university, to say a few words about and on behalf of the university. After that, Cass Sunstein will introduce our keynote speaker. So, Tom Rosenbaum.
Very kind of you. I just want to extend my welcome. On behalf of the university, I wanted to thank in particular, of course, Martha and Cass for organizing this conference. At least I will get a little bit of it, education by staying tonight. I couldn't help note the irony of being handed a stack of papers, however, about an internet conference. But we'll enjoy reading them as well. So when I was looking through all the abstracts, it reminded me of this cartoon in the New Yorker, which has two dogs talking to each other, and they look pretty discontented, and one says, the horrible thing about email is that there's no one to bite. But I guess that the point of this conference in some ways is the internet can in fact bite back. And trying to understand those ramifications is clearly a major societal issue. At Chicago, we are deeply involved in the internet, not just use, but research. You may know that the technology of grid communications has originated here in collaboration with Argonne National Lab. This is the way of harnessing lots of different computers to work on big problems and transfer large data sets. We have a lot of research in terms of social networking, 6 degrees of separation, and how knowledge moves, both in terms of social and scientific networks. And of course, the law school has been a leader in terms of generating hostile emails to the provost's office by banning wireless in the various classrooms during lecture times. I think next to parking, that's probably the greatest issue. The subject, of course, of today's and tomorrow's discussions about privacy and free speech and the internet is a complex one, and one that I think mates well with the University of Chicago approach of airing and understanding all arguments, not just stating them, and in particular is well matched to the law school with its tradition of inquiry and verbal combat in the most positive sense. And so it's really a proud moment for me as provost to see this in action and to speak to the quality and exceptionalism of the law school and the university this way. And I hope that you who contribute and are visiting will fully take advantage of it. I know that this is understood well by Professor Lessig, who spent some time here and has continued to blaze paths in this area. But for a fuller treatment of that, let me turn the podium over to Cass to speak to our guest plenary speaker.
Well, it is not merely a pleasure, but a joy to be here to welcome you for this conference, and also to introduce the most imaginative legal scholar on the planet, Larry Lessig. I printed out his resume yesterday, and it was really, really long. I have a lot of paper in my office, and all the paper was exhausted by the resume, and I packed it up, but then I discovered I didn't have my class notes ready to be transported with me, so I printed them, and they didn't print, and it's because the paper had run out, and the 40 pages or so of Larry Lessig's resume that was half of it. It was 80 pages. So this is a person of immense and varied achievement. A few facts for you. He has degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, from Cambridge, and from Yale. He is taught at the University of Chicago, Harvard, and at Stanford as a voting member of the faculty. And at each of them, here's a little secret that he may not fully know, at each of them, he is both beloved and believed to be still a member of the community. In terms of his public work, he has written a number of exceptionally influential and unbelievably creative books, including Code and Code the Second, Free Culture, The Future of Ideas, and most recently, Remix, which captures some of his speaking style. He is a founder, maybe the founder, of the Creative Commons and of the Stanford Center for the Internet and Society. To say he's founded those things is greatly to understate what he has founded. How well I remember, as if it was a day ago, a conversation on the fourth floor of this building in which Professor Lessig said he wanted to teach a seminar next year on the law of cyberspace. And as his friend, I was worried for him and maybe even worried about him. The law, why was he going into this field? What would become of him? Well, that's a field he has founded. In terms of intellectual achievements and contributions, they are immense. There are people all over the planet. I'm not sure if Professor Lessig adequately has been told this. There are people all over the planet who are teaching an article of his called The Regulation of Social Meaning, which is an exceptionally powerful treatment of the ways that social meanings are given rather than chosen by each of us. We're subject to them, but we haven't selected them. That is replete with ideas. The idea of translation as a tool of constitutional interpretation, that is pervasive in the legal culture. In some ways, it seems, given the immense variety and range of his work, to be a very small part. But there are law school classrooms all over the United States in which people make references. This happened to me 2 weeks ago, so it's alert to the mind, make reference to translation. And I wonder, does everyone know what Professor Lessig said about that? And to be sure, everyone knows what Professor Lessig said about that. A constitution for one of the nations of Eastern Europe was written in the basement of this building under Professor Lessig's guidance. We had a center on constitution making in Eastern Europe here, which had a huge impact. I think the person of our group who did most in terms of practical value, did the most of practical value, was most constructive working with others and sustaining efforts was our speaker today. And I haven't mentioned yet what Professor Lessig is most well known for, which is his work on copyright, free culture, the internet, copying, net neutrality, a constellation of ideas which combine a kind of amazing mastery of technical detail to really raise the bar on what lawyers do with what's easy to kind of live with but not to identify, which is a sort of relentless, quiet, gentle, moral passion that has redefined not just one field, but about 5 of them. What you don't know about Professor Lessig, what you might not know, includes 3 elements. He was a character on The West Wing, and Christopher Lloyd, who played Professor Lessig, actually cited his book, Code, and referred to some of his work in Eastern Europe. More important than that, more impressive in my view, is that Boing Boing TV showed a performance by Monochrome of a love song for Lessig. Almost a year ago, I say sentimentally, to the day. What you certainly don't know, at least with the detail of some of us in this room, is that Professor Lessig is an astounding friend, a person of immense loyalty, humor, generosity, and kindness. The sort of person one encounters rarely in life, whom once a friend is a friend for life, no matter how frequently or infrequently you see him. It's a joy, it's a pleasure, it's an honor to introduce the most imaginative legal scholar on the planet, and my friend, Larry Lessig.
It is enormously, I can't even say it, it's enormously wonderful to be back to my home, where I first started thinking about the law and then was pulled away by someone I was in love with, and then came back to teach the law and was pulled away by not people I was in love with, but still. It's wonderful to be back around friends and people who continue to inspire. It's not clear I was going to make it back. When Cass first wrote me about 6 months ago asking me to come to this extraordinary event, there was a link lost in our communication, leaving me believing I was not invited to come and Cass believing that in fact I had agreed to come. So when about 4 weeks ago students frantically started contacting me about my coming, it was not clear I could actually make it, but I saw the title and the subject and the people who were here, and I thought it would be fun to come. So I arranged things so I could come in, and I have to leave to see my parents tomorrow. But then I focused on the subject, which is actually more complicated and interesting than the title makes it seem. And I realized that, in fact, my ability to contribute to this subject is dwarfed by the other people who've participated in this conference, whose work has been the most important and inspirational in thinking about the deep and complicated relationship that this conference raises. So I was not sure I actually should come, and then the 2-hour drive from O'Hare convinced me again perhaps I shouldn't have come. And we had a technical challenge at the very end, which was the topping to make it seem like I maybe shouldn't be here, but here I am, and I'm eager to share a little idea about how to think about this problem, which is at the center of this conference's agenda. So I'm going to start with some stories to frame this little idea. And the first story begins in the early 1980s, when I spent a lot of time traveling, before I came here, to this place, the Soviet Union. And I was on a train once from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and I encountered a professor, a Soviet professor. And he explained this to me. He said, "We have a better system of free speech here than you do in America." Right, this is 1982. I was a little puzzled by that claim. I said, "What exactly could you mean by that?" He said, "Well, you in America, you read the New York Times and you believe you know the truth. In the Soviet Union, we know all the papers lie. So we read 7 papers and we learn to triangulate on the truth." That's the first story. Here's the second. I want you to think about something I want to call the attention span problem. So the attention span problem has a certain structure to it. Structure is the time it takes to understand an issue is greater than the time the issue merits. Right? So you're constrained by your view to understand the issue in one particular way, but when you actually look, it's actually a more complicated issue than what you think. So my life every 10 years seems to be at the center of one of these issues. A little more than a decade ago, I was in the center of one with Microsoft. I was appointed to be a special master in the case. Microsoft accused me of being, quote, biased. It's a totally insignificant issue that I was a special master in the case, but for many, many years, people believed, in fact, I had been removed from the case because I was biased. That's a function of the attention span problem, because to understand what, in fact, happened takes more than the time the case merited. Maybe it's a little ironic karmic justice on my latest book, Remix. The second example of this I want to share with you is something that happened because of a remix. This is something that happened in April of this year. I was going to this place to testify about network neutrality. 2 days before I was to testify, an article appeared on the blog Red State. This article focused on a video that was posted on YouTube. This video was a remix of a speech I had given at Google. So at Google, I had given a talk about the subject of remix. It was a 61-minute speech. And in the course of that 61-minute speech, I showed a whole series of examples of video remix. And these examples of video remix were meant to elicit understanding of exactly what's going on out there. Some of these examples were subjects that I believed in, the merits of what the remix said. Some I didn't, but that wasn't the point. The point was to demonstrate what was going on. Well, this person who remixed my 61-minute speech boiled it down to about 2 minutes. And the 2 minutes was comprised of me being introduced at Google and then showing this video. So it goes on like this, but the point was the person who interpreted this interpreted me as a Jesus hater. So I was a Jesus hater, and that was affirmed by this man the morning I was to testify at the United States Senate. And when I testified at the United States Senate about network neutrality, this was in the context of a Red State article that had called upon every Republican senator to absent themselves from my testimony, because why would Republican senators ever pay attention to a Jesus hater? And indeed, when I testified, there were no Republicans in the room. And then this was grabbed, this fantastic site that the GOP had, the Barack book site, which had all the, quote, friends of Barack. And I became a friend of Barack here with Rahm Emanuel. Rahm got a better job than I did. But pointing to my Jesus-hating status, sort of qualifying me as one of the enemies that America needed to fear, and my association with Barack, of course, qualified him not to be president. This is an attention span problem. This requires 30 seconds to understand this issue. It merits 0.3 seconds of attention. The result is the issue is just misunderstood. Okay, that's the second story. Here's a third story. So a friend, I will not name him, let's just call him A, was an undergraduate at Stanford. He had a blog. And in this blog, as an undergraduate, he was describing his life as a freshman at Stanford. And he described in one part of this story a little bit of soft stalking, right? Nothing serious. He was, as any kind of 17-year-old kid, he was talking about falling in love and trying to find out exactly how to associate with this woman with whom he had fallen in love, and placing himself in stairwells as she came down so he could meet her accidentally and say, "Oh, so funny running into you," and all that sort of stuff. So I was at a party with this freshman at Stanford Law School here, and in a group of friends with him standing there, I retold this story of the blog and how he was in this quandary of this soft stalking. Well, my friend A reacted a little bit like this. I don't want to show you his picture, but this is basically his expression to me. And he said, "Not cool, man." And I said, "What's the problem here?" He said, "The blog's private." And I said, "Private? It's a blog. It's a web log. It's a worldwide web log visited by the world, widely visited by the world. That's the whole point." And he said, "I don't care who can read it. I care who it is meant for, and it is meant for people who read my blog." Okay, those are the stories. Here's the argument. So we need to recognize, I think, that we're in the middle of an extraordinary change. Not this change, but a different kind of change here. There are elements to this change. I want to identify 3 elements. Number 1, we're at a period where we have an extraordinary explosion of data that we all have access to. Second, the data and the architectures are inspiring us to much worse behavior than we have ever been captured engaging in. And number 3, these data survive forever. They live out there forever. So let's break this down a little bit more. All of these are familiar to you. So more, things like Flickr or MySpace, or sites like Facebook, which, of course, gather an extraordinary amount of data about people and their lives, and then technologies like Google that make it instantly accessible to anybody who wonders anything about a particular person. More stuff, more accessible than ever to people who don't know us. That's the first important point. Second, the architectures inspire us to behave worse and capture the bad behavior. And indeed, how we behave, or how it's expected for us to behave, has changed because of these architectures, and the expectations about how to behave change. So, for example, people engage in this kind of behavior much more than they typically would, and it gets captured. And then I had the experience as a teacher of this law of cyberspace class that Katz described. I don't know if many of you remember this central part of the cyberspace used to be called Usenet. Usenet was this distributed messaging system. It had these hierarchies of messages. For most of the life of Usenet, people would post messages, they would be carried to machines across the world, and they would disappear after 2 or 3 days. Then this fantastic site came along, Deja News. And what Deja News did is go back and collect all of these and index them and put them into a searchable database. So when I taught the law of cyberspace first here and then first at Yale, then here, and then at Harvard, we had a show and tell part to the class where kids would get up and show the coolest thing they've discovered. And so some kid got up at the class at Harvard and described the cool thing he discovered, Deja News. And he put into the search engine the name of a prominent Harvard law student. And instantly, a Usenet posting came up. And this was the substance of the posting. And the issue of this conference was salient 10 years ago to everybody in the room. Okay, third, this stuff lives forever. There's an extraordinary set of work being done now by Victor Meyer-Schönberger, which points to the extraordinary curse that digital technologies are producing. The curse that has been told in many fictional accounts and in some psychological accounts of people who never forget. It actually is a condition. There are people who can remember every single thing that happens, and they're paralyzed by this reality of remembering everything all the time. And in fact, forgetting is a healthy part of what it is to be human. It makes it possible for us to generalize and to move forward and to imagine doing things differently, never trapped by this world of constant remembering, never lingering in the space of this constant remembering. Victor's point is, of course, this lingering defines our world in relation to these technologies, as everything we have continues to hang there to be recalled at any particular point. Now, these 3 elements produce 3 different problems. One, the problem of extraordinarily harmful speech. Second, the problem of speech decoupled from relevant context. And third, the problem of what I'll call no longer relevant speech. So harmful speech. So think, for example, about a story I told in my first book, Code, about a kid called Ibex. So in this cyber law class, we would have a place where people had a discussion group. That was a Usenet group, but it could be any number of contexts, similar way. This is early in the life of the cyberspace. Most of the kids in these classes had never even used the internet before. Email was not the center of their life. There was no such thing as the World Wide Web being part of what they did. So it's the very beginning stages of understanding how you engage virtually. And in this class, kids got onto this virtual community space and started talking with each other. And they adopted pseudonyms. So Speed Racer was a very important part of this class. Mad Max was a very cool part of this class. All sorts of people developed characters, and they played these characters in this space. And for a period of time, the class produced an enormously interesting and rich conversation as people learned from this weird environment of exchange. And then Ibex appeared. Ibex was the most vicious person imaginable. I understand he went on to be a reporter at a major newspaper, but he was an extraordinarily vicious person. And he set it to be his cause to attack people in the class by name for characteristics such as their race or intelligence or background, economic background. And after 3 or 4 of these attacks, the community, the space, was gone. Nobody would say a word. And it wasn't just the virtual space that was destroyed. It was the classroom as well, as all of us sat there wondering, who was this person? Who was this person who had destroyed the class? And we could no longer treat each other in the same way. The spirit of happy exchange had been eliminated by the recognition that deep down, not so deep, there was this extraordinarily vile creature in our midst. Harmful speech. Number 2, think about decoupled speech. So acontextual speech. How many of you Twitter? How many of you know what Twitter is? Okay, great. So here's my Twitter page, as it appeared this afternoon. Of course I love you, but it must be our secret. Now, you're thinking, oh my God, yeah, I'm married and I have, a kid. So you're wondering, what is this about, right? And then I'll show you a little bit more of the Twitter page. Please ignore the next message from me. It's a demonstration of the importance of context. Right, so I posted this very quickly after so nobody could have any ambiguity about this, to sort of bring out exactly what things like Twitter are producing all the time. These bits of text that are pulled out of context, and they have a clear and understandable meaning to you. You're not uncertain at all about them, but their meaning doesn't have any necessary relationship to what in fact they mean, and it creates an extraordinary danger in some contexts as these meanings get twisted. And finally, problem of no longer relevant. Victor tells a story of this Canadian who was trying to get entry into the United States, and the border police had done some research and found an article that he had published, which in the 1960s he revealed that he had experimented with LSD. In the 1960s, this is 2005, and they would not permit him to enter the United States on the basis of this document that was now perfectly easily searchable on Google because it was in an article that was now accessible through the free access that Google gives. So the drug-dealing Canadian was kept out, and we were all safer because of that. Now, people look at these problems, and often they say, those of us like me who typically cheerlead for the internet, that they are insignificant. But they are not insignificant. They are extraordinarily serious. This harmful speech grows in its significance because the economy within which this happens mucks about with the traditional identity and traceability of economies within which human exchange happens. Ordinarily, human exchange happens within such economies where accountability is at the core. We know who has done something. And knowing who has done something, of course, changes the willingness of someone to do the thing which we know they have done. There's less of that accountability here. I don't mean that there's less than there is on the streets of New York, but the point is we don't share every secret we have with the people we run into on the streets of New York, yet we've been induced in this space to share with an enormously wide range of people who will not be constrained by this accountability. Now, of course, you're just not as vulnerable then in a context like New York. Of course, you're vulnerable in other ways. You might be attacked, but you're not as vulnerable in the meme space, in the meaning space, in the place where the psychology of your interaction with others is controlled. That's significant. Or think about the decoupling problem. This problem of out-of-context speech is often responded to with, well, it's a simple solution to this, just provide more context. But here was the point of my story about the attention span problem. Because, of course, how far you look in order to understand is not self-evident. It's like, can you interpret a contract and tell me it's ambiguous? Not from the face of the contract. There's no way from the face to know whether it's ambiguous. It's the context that tells you whether it's ambiguous. And so too here, you can't know how much you need to look at in order to know whether you have a misunderstanding here. It doesn't self-identify as misunderstood. So again, captured in view, you think you see everything, yet if you could be induced to see more, you would see there is more there. That's a significant problem in the way this behavior is interpreted. And finally, with the context of no longer relevant data, this endless data produced by all of these systems that connect us in ways which monitor what we do lives in a world where it's now more expensive to erase than to keep these data, which means that there's no natural erosion of this data. It just stays. That's a new problem. Each of these problems, I think, is dimension of new. In this harmful speech problem, the alien communities that we live in are familiar. Now, think of that concept of an alien community, a community where we don't actually know the people within the community. It's almost impossible to imagine it as a community, but for the fact that many of our colleagues and friends live in such communities right now. The problem of decoupled space, decoupled meaning is in an important sense new. It's a certain problem that comes from the democratization of this speech space. Before, this problem lived in a kind of New York Times versus Sullivan economy, by which I mean the people who were in public, about whom this stuff was spoken, were public people, which means they could direct attention to themselves to respond to problems that might have been produced by this out-of-context speech. The opportunity to respond was built into their publicness, and there was an ethic among those who reported to cover the response. Democratization radically changes this. There's no control, no obligation, no ethic to respond to the thing that's been misunderstood, even though there's endless opportunity to contextualize. There's no contextualization because there's no inducement to contextualize where there's no ethic or obligation to look beyond what appears plain on the surface. And with this no longer relevant speech, this favor of friction, which was for the whole of human history built into how we dealt with our past, the favor of this friction is gone. So what do we do about that? Well, I think, number one, we're going to recognize that we, meaning those of us over the age of 40, will not understand this. We're not going to understand this change right now. When we think and look at the way our kids are interacting in this space, I think we will recognize an older time, an older ethic that they live with. That's the story of my friend A. The story of my friend A reminds us of a time when people internalized the idea that you just didn't talk about certain things, that there were boundaries, and you lived with those boundaries. A time not just where private people respected those boundaries, but think about the benefit JFK or FDR got from these norms which said, even though the stuff is in some sense public, it is not to be rendered in public. Our kids get this in a way we don't. Our kids internalize the idea that the appropriateness of where this stuff is to flow is governed by the community here, and we don't. And we're puzzled by things which are obvious to them. And that's a gap between us and them that we need to recognize and internalize with a bit of humility as we think about this problem, which of course is really their problem. These normative exclusionary rules, which were part of our past, will be part of our future in a way that's bizarre to us. We don't see how that's possible, but they see. They see that the practice of not seeing is what it is to be an ethical person in this space. And these norms substitute for limitations that had been imposed by other forms of technical control. So number one, we have an older time that those of us older don't quite get. Number two, we're going to have a more Soviet time. Right? That's the point of my story about the Soviets. Right? Our kids are better triangulators than we are. They're better at the idea of understanding there's 7 different things to think about here. And I predict they're going to be better at building in the disbelief that's appropriate 1 or 2 or 3 times around before they credit some claim that they have been exposed to. Think about these films, just 10 years old, where the plot of the film was a spouse sitting at the computer, always accidentally, reading the email of her spouse or his spouse, and discovering an email advertising pornography, and thinking, oh my God, my husband or my wife is consuming pornography, right? Today, the story is not even understandable because, of course, all of our email accounts are filled with this sort of crap, right? But at that time, there was not yet the recognition of the presumption against the presumption of guilt that led people to this being an interesting story. Yet, I think increasingly this kind of shock has produced an opposite, a kind of do not register response in our kids until it's confirmed. And this is an appropriate response to the spread of Soviet lies everywhere. But Soviet lies, which, like the Soviet citizens, they learned to deal with. Third, I think our kids are going to move into a more discriminating time. You've seen this battle about email at the White House recently, right? And this is a battle in part because the law doesn't have any way to discriminate or to distinguish between the documents that the president drafts or memos given to the president about certain important public policy matters and Twitters or emails or questions sent in an email. Can't distinguish. Our kids look at that fact and think it's absurd about us that we can't distinguish like this because they have a richer understanding of the appropriate weight to place around any of these speech acts. And as that rich understanding develops, they will develop this more discriminating practice. Okay, so that's the first sense in which they are alien. We're not going to understand them. The second thing is to recognize that even they, the we here, is still emerging. The responses here are still developing. And I invite you to think back to a place that might be impossible for many to remember, but the web circa 1997. So here's the picture of the web circa 1997, this happy little Yahoo site, which, of course, Yahoo was this effort at organizing the space. And they had people who literally sat down and filled out these links to different organized topics because the perception was it was a massive, unorganized mess. Now, even Yahoo was not very good at this. And the problems of the web at that time, I remember thinking the web is going to fail. It's useless. It's totally useless. Endless amounts of random and vile, acontextualized data that how is it ever going to be transversed by anything other than accident? Right? Then, of course, what came along was a technology that radically changed our relationship to this stuff. Indeed, think about the way it organized the web's data and the problem we're thinking about here, about acontextualized data in the context of our own life, and it's the same problem. It's just in a different sphere. And so what becomes to be understandable in this context is a function of a technology we don't yet understand. So the we, the community that will be responding in this space, is still developing, and even for our kids, it doesn't yet exist. And number 3, the thing to keep in mind as we try to think how to respond to this is that there is tons of this stuff that we're all skeptical of that is extraordinarily good. I would really commend to you this amazing study, which was coordinated by scholar Mimi Ito and has some of the most prominent people studying kids' behavior in these spaces. Enormous amount of data gathered through interviewing and studying how kids actually behave in this space that is producing confidence about the edifying half of this world and the value that comes out of these kinds of relationships, even against the harm that I think we need to recognize. Okay, that's qualifications. Then, so how do we think about responding to this? It's almost impossible to maybe come back to Chicago and not feel the irony of my first and most prominent point here. But that is, I think we need to be law skeptics here. Be humble about the role that the law can play. Right? Law has a limited utility. Now, of course, much of my work in this space has been trying to understand what that utility is. And I tried to advance that understanding by getting us to distinguish between the codes that function here. In particular, legal code versus computer code, and recognize that both of these codes in this space enable and constrain. So this code enables in important ways, and the code that built this Second Life virtual world enabled in certain ways. Those codes made possible things that weren't possible before. And so too do these codes constrain. This code, or at least in theory, that code's supposed to constrain. I don't know anymore, but that code's supposed to constrain. And we have codes built into the space that obviously constrain access in ways that advance certain social goods. And they do these things not just separately, they act together. The game of understanding law in cyberspace is about understanding this interaction. So it is American Express, which is protected here by a certain set of technologies, code in the sense of the block that is imposed by the user ID necessary to get access to account information, and also protected by U.S. law that forbids getting access in an unauthorized way to that account information. These two codes work and complement each other, and not just these codes. Right? Many other codes regulate in this space. So I wanted the New Chicago School to describe this multiple set of modalities here. Law being one, law which is an ex ante rule enforced by the state. Technology or code in this sense being another. This is an MIT t-shirt. 299,792,458 meters per second is not just a good idea, it's the law, right? The law at the speed of light, which are simultaneous in codes imposed by God. That's a small g. It's not a Jesus hater. I'm just being ambiguous between the codes imposed by whatever divine being there is and the coders who produce this space. Then there are norms, right? Norms like men don't wear dresses, however much I'd want to wear a dress. Giving this lecture here, men don't do that. And if I did that, then the community would enforce a certain punishment here, not obviously viciously. You'd laugh a little bit, but you'd treat me even more weirdly than you did when I left to go to Harvard, okay? And finally, there's a dynamic here of markets which constrain, that set prices, simultaneous restrictions enforced by the interaction between supply and demand in the law. Now, in this mix, as I've said before, the problem here is that law seems to be pretty insignificant. We don't like that much. We're lawyers, right? So it's just one of four in this mix, and that can't be any good. And then I tried to revive law in this space by reminding people that, of course, law has a special relationship here. Law affects these other things that regulate. So think about the way law does this in a case like smoking. Law can induce norms. Smokers suck, so to change the norms around smoking so that people face higher costs when they make a choice to smoke. Law can tax cigarettes. Of course, we subsidize tobacco production, but okay, tax cigarettes as a way to increase the market constraint on smoking. And law can also act by regulating code. It can deem cigarettes nicotine delivery devices, as the Clinton administration tried. And that would facilitate regulating the delivery device in a way that would change the desire to be addicted to that drug. So these codes act together in regulating, but it's law that can regulate the code. And the question for the policymaker has always got to be, what mix of these regulators is ideal? But the thing we have to keep in view here is that law's power, even with this edifying picture of law interacting with these other modalities, is always contingent upon a bunch of things you can't predict ex ante. And its role is relatively limited. And in contexts where the social meaning of interacting with the law is self-defeating, then the law fails as it interacts. So think about the law around defamation as it affects the internet. I'm going to introduce this by thinking about a related context that was first marked in 2000 by John Zittrain, an article in Stanford Law Review, where he made this argument. He said the problem of privacy is basically the same as the problem of copyright. I think that's kind of weird, but he said, both of these problems are basically data out of control. So in the privacy context, it's facts about me that I lose control over, like my name, social security number, age, address, credit card numbers. In the copyright context, it's data equals the copyrighted material that the copyright owners lose control of as they spread in these very simple digital formats and compete with the copyright owner's market. In both cases, the problem is a lack of control. In both cases, the problem is because of technology. A change in technology produces this problem, whereas before, technology helped control these data. With privacy, the costliness of search and surveillance reinforced privacy. In copyright, the costliness of just copying reinforced and helped copyright. Now, technology destroys these control for these data. So the cheapness of searching and surveillance harms privacy, and the cheapness of copying hurts copyright. And so with each, there are two possible responses to this problem. One is a private response, and one is a public response. The private response would be to build self-protection, mechanisms to protect that the owner of the data employs. So with privacy, you can do things like reveal less data or choose privacy-friendly sites. With copyright, you can use digital rights management technology or build your business in alternative business models. The public solution is law. So privacy, you can imagine comprehensive privacy regulation. You'd be living in Oz if you imagine that, but you can imagine it. And in copyright, you could imagine increased copyright protection. You don't have to imagine that. There's been 24 bills to increase the protection of copyright in the last 10 years. So that's what we've been doing. So as you think about these together, there's an interesting public choice point that's maybe boring because it's been so remarked on. But if you think about whether the private responses are effective, with respect to copyright, in fact, they can be moderately effective. With respect to privacy, they can't be effective at all. And if that's true, then what would the rational public response be? Well, with copyright, it would be to do little. But with privacy, it would be to do lots. What's the actual public response? Well, with copyright, to do lots. But with privacy, to do absolutely nothing at all at a federal level of any significance here. Now, the point is to see there's a similar point to Zittrain's about copyright and defamation. So in both of these, there's a harm here, which is uncontrolled sharing of the defamatory fact or the copyrighted work. Both have a remedy that has been rendered self-defeating and been rendered self-defeating by norms of this space. So in the copyright wars space, wars which my friend, the late Jack Valenti, referred to as his own, quote, terrorist war, where apparently the terrorists are our children, these norms that have been induced in response to this terrorist war have given birth to things like the Pirate Party and an increasing movement of copyright abolitionism. People who believe that copyright should be eliminated. It was a regulation for the 20th century. The 21st century doesn't need it. And in the context of that war, the effectiveness of the legal regulation continues to be eroded. And that's the same problem in the context of defamation. As any lawyer will advise you now, to sue someone who defames you on the internet is to throw gasoline on the fire. It's worse than doing nothing. And indeed, the law makes it even harder because, of course, the targets in the context of defamation for dealing with the defamation, ISPs, are immunized from worrying about that particular problem, but they're not immunized from worrying about the problem of copyright. So the point is, law can do little in these contexts, where the social meaning of the law's intervention renders the law's intervention ineffective. Second point here is to begin to think about how we can practice them, if law is not the core response, privacy in this non-private world. And there's a rich set of research by anthropologists and others that point to places where people lived in a non-private world but developed norms of privacy. So you don't look or you don't speak about things that are technically public but are normatively private. You exercise this kind of judgment. But there's a different layer in which I think this has got to happen in the context of the internet. Think about the press in the context of this new form of free, democratized expression. The standard form of objective reporting in the press right now is A said and then B said. So A said, global warming is a serious problem we have to deal with. B said, it's not. A said, there's a serious set of issues that we have to address about the danger of chromium-6 in people in the workplace. B says, there's not. And the press reports A and B's view in a way that allows the press to appear to be objective. And that system, in the context of relatively responsible sources, might make sense. In this context, it fails. What's necessary in this context is increasing, non-objective perhaps, but an increasing judgment that's necessary by people participating in this place. So global warming is real. McCain is, and you pick however to fill that out. Or Obama is, however you want to fill that out. Or most importantly here, Lessig is not a Jesus hater, right? But the point is to practice judgment here, because one response of this space is people will recognize that one of many values you can demonstrate is to earn the reward of being right about this judgment. And learning that you have been right is the best way to advance the market in this space. But the third most important response here, I think, is that we have to be technological innovators. We need here, critically need here, this is a boring, geeky point, I'm sorry, but it's true, something called an identity layer. So what's that mean? Well, the internet, for simple lawyers like me, looks like this. Has 4 layers. Physical layer, the wires or the wireless spectrum that allows the computers to talk. The logical layer, the thing that frames TCP/IP so that computers can talk in the internet way. Applications, like operating systems or browsers, and content. And these things work together in this layered way to produce what we know as the internet. There has to be an identity layer that's added to this. What's that mean? I don't mean identity layer in what we think of as identity 1.0, like Microsoft's passport, where you say, I trust you, Microsoft, take all of my data and protect it and give it out as you think it's important to other people to have. That just will never work, and the world has recognized this. There's now extraordinarily good work being done in the context of something called Identity 2.0. There's something called the Identity Gang. Identity 2.0 is the work that they do. The gang is filled with leading technologists in the space, including some from Microsoft, but obviously not just from Microsoft. And what this gang is trying to do is to work out exactly how to build an identity architecture where no one person controls all the data there is about you. You credibly get to give what there is to others and control how others get it. But the critical feature here is if we think about all the attributes that might be associated with a person and represent it with these beautifully graphed objects that I produced all by myself here. One feature, one element here that's the critical one is the one that refers back to a person. And the general problem we have in the context of identity on the internet right now is that this link is too easily established. So because we have no simple way to certify facts about ourselves except by revealing all the data there is about each of us, all sorts of contexts get to know directly who it is that they are dealing with. And in that context, it's almost impossible to imagine creating a world where there's some privacy, if by privacy we mean control over how people learn or get access to facts about us. Now, we can achieve here, using this architecture of Identity 2.0, a world where this link back to a particular person is contingent, or indeed transitory, so that we can continue to have lots of data out there that entities can use to make the world a more efficient place, but that's effectively pseudonymized in the sense that there's no easy way to get back to the person who's produced that data. So that's producing more data that people can do lots of stuff about, but less data in the sense of no easy way to trace back to the entity responsible for the data. Now, the thing to see is that if we could enable this, we could enable a version of something that Myers-Schoenberger talks about, what we could call the decay function, as this data connects back to an individual. So the decay function functions the way the original copyright system functioned. Initially, you have the link back to a particular individual. My Facebook account identifies me directly as the person that said all these stupid things about stuff on my wall or on other people's walls. But the link back to me as an individual is a decaying function. After a period of time, unless I renew that link, it disappears. And if it disappears, then it's not that the facts or the statements disappear. They can survive. But what disappears is a simple way to get it back to a particular person, which allows the horizon to be limited to the horizon we can see right now and facilitate the opportunity to escape the unintended, no longer relevant data in the future. So this functions in a way that allows that identity only if there's an affirmative act to reclaim it. Now, I think we need this identity layer. I think we need Identity 2.0. I think we need this capacity built into the architecture. It's not a need that requires new technology. What it needs is trust. And the trust here comes from two kinds of gives. One give comes from privacy nuts, and I count myself as a privacy nut. And what privacy nuts need to give is allowing a world, at least within democracies, where there's more pseudonymity and less anonymity, by which I simply mean it's possible to trace back to a person if you have the proper authorization, but the identity of the person is not automatically visible to anybody who's getting access to data about that person. So the government, if the government has a valid claim supported by whatever legal process is deemed appropriate, can find out who did whatever criminal act necessitates the government tracking that person down, but no one else is in a position easily to make that kind of trace. So one give by the privacy nuts is to imagine a world where more of that traceability is enabled in exchange for giving up, at least within democracies, the absolute anonymity. The give from the government is to live within a world of real accountability, where when the rules are broken, someone pays for breaking the rules. There's no reason to trust the government in this context if the government's behavior does not lead to consequences that need to be remedied when the rules have been broken. But the problem here is that this practice of government immunity granted to people breaking the rules, either indirectly through the uncertainty of qualified immunity or directly by the government directly passing immunity rules, tells the nuts there's no reason to have trust here. So this critical step to facilitating an architecture that might enable a true protection of privacy depends upon two gives by two entities that have no reason to give. Privacy people who have no reason to trust the government because the government has been so good at demonstrating if they break the law, their law violations will be forgiven. Now there's the argument. Let me end it with one link back. So, as Cass mentioned kindly, this book is my latest book. It's called Remix. Remix actually expresses a view I had about how I should talk about the issues I talk about. And that view was I should constrain myself to constantly build upon what I had just said before. So, if you could watch, and I'm sure you'd be really excited to do that, every one of the last 100 talks that I've made, you can see this evolution as I force myself to think through this in one step further. The problem with this talk is that it had no relationship to anything I've been thinking of for the last 2 years. So I feel cheap because I haven't lived up to my principle here of remix. So I want to end by one little remix that tries to bring in what I typically talk about to this space to think about how it might be relevant here. So one story I love in the context of this culture war story is a story that begins in 1906. When this man, John Philip Sousa, travels to this space to talk about this technology, what he called the, quote, talking machines. John Philip Sousa was not a fan of the talking machines. This is what he had to say. These talking machines are going to ruin the artistic development of music in this country. When I was a boy, in front of every house in the summer evenings, you would find the young people together singing the songs of the day or the old songs. Today you hear these infernal machines going night and day. We will not have a vocal cord left, Sousa said. The vocal cords will be eliminated by a process of evolution, as was the tale of man when he came from the ape. Now, this is the picture I want you to focus on, this picture of young people together singing the songs of the day or the old songs. This is a picture of culture. We could call it, using modern computer terminology, a kind of read-write culture. It's a culture where people participate in the creation and the recreation of their culture. In that sense, it's read-write. And Sousa's fear was that we would lose the capacity to engage in this read-write creativity because of these, quote, infernal machines. They would take it away, displace it. And in its place, we'd have the opposite of read-write creativity, what you could call, using modern computer terminology, a kind of read-only culture. A culture where creativity is consumed, but the consumer is not a creator. A culture in this sense that's top-down, where the vocal cords of the millions of ordinary people have been lost. Now, the point here is to recognize the truth and surprise in the truth of what Sousa said. Because, of course, the 20th century is the century where the production of culture becomes more concentrated than at any point in the history of culture. So this is, for him, a loss, the loss of the read-write culture as it becomes the couch potato read-only culture, never before as passive as it was during this one century. And when I read this, it was a kind of surprise to me, too, because this loss had been invisible to me. I, a production of the 20th century, quintessentially couch potato creature, didn't even imagine that there was this world, didn't even notice that there was this world where the idea of democratic creativity was built inside of the culture, a world where every major form of cultural expression was a normal thing for ordinary people to do. It's not that everybody played the piano, but that you played the piano was not a surprising thing. But in the 20th century, the forms of cultural expression, the film, recorded music, those were things that very few people did. The rest of us just consumed it. And to recognize that this was the difference in the 20th versus the 19th and every century before was, for me, a shocking surprise about the limited vision I had about the nature of creativity that I lived in. But the hope here that I think Sousa shows why this space is so exciting is that the loss can be temporary. Right? The demonstration of the extraordinary creativity that's happening on the net right now is to revive exactly this read-write culture. It's to make it normal again for people to have access to every single important form of cultural expression. If your 16-year-old can't make a movie and upload it to YouTube, you have a serious problem on your hands. So the point is, we've gone back and gone forward. We've escaped this odd century. This capacity has been restored. Right? Now, this is the point that leads me to caution when I think about the serious problems that have been identified in the context of this conference. Caution recognizing the limit in understanding we have and the celebration we need to be having right now about the potential for this space despite these problems and the hope that we can restore those things in the earlier world that we think this space lacks. Thanks very much.
In keeping with the tone of the last remarks, let's have some participation and not a read-only culture. Comments, questions, observations?
This is the Socratic method still practiced here, right? So I can cold call, is that all right? right here. Oh, are you calling? Okay, I can do that.
Like old times.
Yeah.
You talked about 100 lectures, and when we were at the Berkman Center together, I remember your style from then, and you can see such tremendous change since then. But one of the topics that we worked on there was privacy in cyberspace on medical privacy. There seems to be a perfect example of what you talked about, where privacy used to be protected by the lack of technology, private records, paper folders, that are now being potentially technologized with some benefits, but also tremendous problems for privacy, because the most private medical information can now be sent to everybody and everywhere with one click. So I'm wondering about the solution, and you talk about it now costs more to erase than it does to save, but there are also different mechanisms for preserving. I would call it consent. You didn't actually use that word, but creating a consenting process, creating a removing process, a deleting process. How do you see using the technology to bring all these things back together?
Well, it's perfectly appropriate that you ask this question, because I'll confess that most of the thoughts that I've had about identity have been arguments in my head against the exchanges you and I had when we first talked about these issues back at Harvard. When you were talking about, and for good reasons, I'm not questioning your commitment, obviously, to privacy, but the problem around identity cards and your fight against systems that would require any identification out there at all. And what I've become convinced about is that this fight in some ways creates a bigger privacy problem that we hadn't anticipated. And the reason for that is that because we have no reliable, effective way to selectively reveal the identity that we need in any particular context, and because there's such an enormous demand for revealing data in all sorts of contexts, we adopt the second best, which is just to give everything there is. And we produce this environmental disaster from the standpoint of privacy, where all this data are out there and potentially mined for all sorts of illicit purposes. If we had what I know it's very hard to get from this exactly what Identity 2.0 is, other than an invitation to understand it. If we had an effective Identity 2.0 architecture, then all the places where people say it would be fantastic to have data out there. For example, health is a perfect case. If we could gather, actually, effectively, not the fact that you might have the flu, or the fact that my sister might have a debilitating form of cancer, but that there is a person with your characteristics and this fact, he has a flu, in this location, and begin to aggregate that data effectively. The way, of course, Google is demonstrating, even through indirect things like tracing the number of times people search for flu remedies. We could do enormous good for national health, right? We could do things that we can't do right now. That's the premise behind 23andMe, which, of course, is started by the spouse of one of the Google founders, which you turn over your DNA, and they begin to aggregate all these data about all DNA that gets turned over, and they begin to learn things about patterns, which in the existing way in which you gather data about science and DNA is almost impossible to discern. But even there isn't yet an adequate, certainly nothing you would count as adequate, and I would agree with you here, protection for the link between those data and the particular individual that might actually carry it. Until we actually can get support for the building of this identity layer, we're not going to solve this problem, this particular privacy problem. And again, I think we're stuck here and not getting support because we privacy nuts, and here I'm counting myself as a privacy nut, and I certainly always counted you as a privacy nut. We will never trust the government when the government is so brazen about its unwillingness to be responsible or hold other people responsible for violating rules.
I would like to ask you a little bit about Identity 2.0 and why you think that the person whose identity it is should be the person in charge of deciding whether or not that link is drawn. I'll give you a prosaic example of why that might be problematic. Richard Moore talked about the problems of, say, a law banning outing for homosexuals, in that if you're a homosexual and you go around and you associate with other homosexuals, to ban outing would be to, say, ban that person's ability to talk about who he was out with Friday night and where they were. So the kind of link between what you do and your own personality belongs not just to you, but to other people you might associate.
I completely agree with that. And I don't mean to suggest that there's a simple, automatic autonomy right for somebody to reveal whatever or control whatever. I think this is the biggest problem in the early work of Identity 2.0, because they hadn't thought through the fact that governments are going to have a legitimate claim when they come to the identity holder to say, I want to know who this person is who has, for a good reason, we believe, committed this heinous crime. I want to know who that person is. And they hadn't thought about how to build the architecture such that it wasn't just about an individual controlling what's revealed. There also was an overlay and a system for getting traceability back. So I agree, there are going to be a lot of complicated questions here about what it is appropriate to allow people to reveal. But we need to be able to engage in that in a context of a technology that's sophisticated enough to allow the type of subtle distinctions that are going to be required here. It can't be. We will lose an enormous amount of who we are if we're forced into the world, which many governments are now imposing, where basically identity means turning over all data there is. So countries in Asia right now that have identity cards that have absolutely every interesting fact about you on the cards. And to do anything related to the government or increasingly with corporations, you swipe the cards and they have all the information there. No system for selectively revealing according to what they have to. And that's because there's enormous government gains for those architectures, right? And it's not clear the government's really interested in protecting privacy, not even here, right? So until we get that layer in the system, we're not going to facilitate any of this type of subtle distinction.
In a time-constrained world, it seems to me that your Soviet problem of read 7 papers and triangulate runs directly into the attention span problem. And I think that might leave us in the future with kids, and maybe I include my generation in this, who are constantly and unendingly skeptical of everything. How do we move past that?
Including my argument? Is that what you're saying? Maybe. Maybe you're right. I mean, I do think you're exactly right, that the attention span problem makes the Soviet problem worse when it's an enormous range of unfiltered stuff which people get to have to process, right? That was the harm and the benefit to the world of costly news, right? That there was a set of filters there that made sure that certain things just didn't get talked about because they could judge that there wasn't any reason to talk about it. We don't have that world anymore. And so the triangulation is one necessary response to that. It's not clear it's sufficient. And we might exactly get to that. I agree.
We have time for one more question.
It has to be a really good one.
So I hope it's a joke. You expressed confidence about the norms that are likely to be developed by the under 40 crowd with respect to privacy. And I'm a little bit worried, as a member of the under 40 crowd still, I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether that's going to be right, and here's the basis for my skepticism. Oftentimes norms develop based on observed regularities and people conform with what they see other people doing. And privacy has this funny aspect to it, in that when privacy is respected, it's invisible. And when privacy is breached, it's highly visible and draws a lot of attention. So the challenge in my mind in terms of generating the sorts of norms that you'd like to see and I'd like to see is how to make sure that when people are trying to figure out what the norm is and what they should conform to, they get an accurate reflection of actual behavior. And I haven't wrapped my brain around how to do that in the privacy context, where the sorts of behavior that you're trying to encourage and would like to promote are so difficult to discern.
Right. So one way in which the norms get created was the interaction that I had with my friend A. Right? I was shocked by his response, and I have radically changed the way I think about this point, and I tell this story enough so that I think people begin to think too about what are the appropriate norms for something like this. But the second way in this becomes I think a second way in which the only way that this could be solved is that we multiply the number of people who feel empowered to complain in a particular way about this. Now, this is the way in which, the access to opportunities to kvetch about this helps the problem. So, in a world where, only public figures get to talk about public matters in a way that anybody can take note of, the problem that you're identifying about learning and teaching norms is a significant one, because there are a lot of issues that they would be focusing on before they got to these issues. But in a world of literally 100 million blogs, and the practice of people believing that it's not just their responsibility to consume, but to create, and not just in the context of creating remix, but in the context of creating active public statements about what they think things ought to be, I think there's at least the possibility for that conversation. I don't have confidence that there's that conversation. I don't have confidence that, the kids that are kids like you, are under the age of 40, are going to solve the problem in a way that even satisfies them. What I was starting with, though, is recognizing that solving the problem in a way that satisfies them is not likely to solve the problem in a way that satisfies me or people like me, because we can't help but be set by a frame here that will look radically different when we look at our kids than our kids' experience. So in some sense, we analyze the problem relative to them. Not to deny that there's a problem relative to them or you, but it's to say that we should be skeptical of our response. And there's lots of potential for them to deal with it in a more sensible way because of the opportunity to participate in the dialogue about what it should look like. And increasingly, a norm that expects they will. That's what's weird here. Right? It's this, by the nature of the place, I'm allowed to say there's a nature here. The nature of that place, which has been constructed obviously to have this nature, but the nature of this place, you can't be there without participating in what is effectively public speech now. That's very new in the way in which young kids participate in the world. And that's an opportunity, a hopeful opportunity. I'm not sure I'm convinced it solves the problem you've identified, but it's at least a reason to think that they're more likely to solve it. You're more likely to solve it than certainly I ever would.
Okay, I think we should notice that Professor Lessig's comments ended with the word celebration. So I'd like to celebrate three things. The fact that Professor Lessig has come, the content and nature of his speech, and the fact that we now have a reception right outside.